So, I know that this class is learning, and the reason I know is last Sunday night, someone texted that to me. And that's exactly what we were talking about, right? That the animal kingdom doesn't have the capacity to think like that or to reason like that. And I won't tell you that it was my wife that sent that to me, but that's who it was. And I wasn't quite sure how to take that, but anyway, like I said, that's what we're talking about, and that's what makes that funny, right? Because chickens can't think that way, and we all know that. They don't have the capacity. Last week we started looking at the argument from consciousness, or the argument from mind, and we talked about what led us to that as we went through our teleological argument and our design and how the human being is designed. And the Darwinists and the materialists say that we're all just atoms. And so the question was, how do you get from atoms to consciousness? And more than that, how do you get from atoms to self-consciousness, where that we know that we exist and we know that we are a knower? How do you get there just from atoms? We said that self-consciousness required a minimum of 3, if you remember. That there had to be an object that you observe. There had to be the object, the observer, and then a confirmer that confirmed that you did indeed recognize that. So we talked about how do you keep a man in prison for his entire life if his physical body changes substantially over his life, and how do you continue to hold that person accountable for that? And we said that there had to be a unity of self, and that unity of self, we said, comes from our dual nature. We have a dual nature as human beings, where half of our makeup, or you might say we're half made up of the physical body and half made up of a spiritual substance, a non-material body. And so we term that dualism, that human beings have dualism and none of the other animals have or constituted in that way. And we said that our Christian worldview, from what we had looked at, we could say that human beings, the human beings that God freely chose to create, consist in 2 substances. That's what we said. One is material, one is immaterial. One body being uniquely human, and one spirit being similar in substance to God, who is spirit. And so we're making a distinction here between all of the animal kingdom and then human beings as being specifically set apart, and they have distinguishing characteristics that sets them apart from the rest of the world. Philosopher Anthony O'Hare said this: the presence of thought, reflection, and self-conscious belief is what makes human activity different from the conscious but unreflective behavior of non-linguistic animals, which is really all the others in the animal kingdom. It's this idea that they can't reflect. They are not self-conscious that distinguishes us as being different from the animal kingdom. And this is very difficult for the Darwinists of the world to reconcile. How do we get from atoms to consciousness? But there's something that's even deeper than that humans have that they don't share with the rest of the world, and that is there is a moral law. And that characteristic is not found in any of the other creatures. It's a moral law that we say is written upon man's heart. It's something that's innate. It's something that we were created with. And that moral law resides within our consciousness as human beings. It's a non-negotiable law. There's no equivocation to it. It's a non-negotiable law. It's a law that everyone recognizes. It's a law that we might say just is. It just is a law, and it's part of being a human being. The moral law is also objective truth, and that means that it is specific truth. It is the same for you and me and everyone else who lives and who has ever lived. It means it doesn't matter what culture you're in, what race you are, what language you speak, what part of the world you live in. It's objective truth. The moral law is the same for everybody, everywhere, across all people and all places and all times, and that makes it an objective law. And that's counter to what we hear so often these days about law being morality and moral law being relative, where they say that my law is my law and your law is your law. You leave me alone, I'll leave you alone. And so there is no absolute truth of right and wrong. It's whatever people want it to be. But there is absolute truth. And we know that there's absolute truth because there is a innate morality within human beings. There is innate human moral obligations. There's a sense of right and wrong that's written on man's heart. And you can't say that that comes from Adam's. So it has to come from somewhere else. Christians say that it is rooted in the consciousness of man or in the spirit of man. But the atheists claim that there's no absolute truth. My truth is my truth, your truth is your truth, and there is no absolute truth. And that's the arguments, that's the root of all the arguments that you hear playing out in society today. The arguments over abortion, the arguments over politics, the arguments over immigration. Every single argument that we read about today in politics and in, in the news, all boils down to people arguing for their truth. That there is no absolute truth, it's a relative truth. And since it's my truth, you should allow me to do that. That's the big argument behind the sexual revolution, the transgender world. You should allow me to express myself that way because that's my truth, and that's the argument that they make. So relative truth is to me is explained very, very well in a popular bumper sticker. How many of you have seen this bumper sticker? It's really popular. I'm surprised more people haven't seen it. So this has been running around town for several years now. And the word is coexist is what it spells out if you're having trouble reading that. It's coexist. The C is the crescent of Islam. The O is the peace symbol. That E is the transgender symbol. The Star of David is the X. There's a star on top of the I. That's the Wiccan symbol for those people that are witches. The S is the Taoist yin yang. And then the T is the cross of Christ. And they say this is one big happy family and let's all just coexist and let's all just get along, because there's no absolute truth. There's just a relative truth. So my truth is true and your truth is true, and we can't criticize one another. But that can't be true because each and every one of these makes an exclusive claim to being the ultimate truth. Islam claims that they are exclusively true to the exclusion of everyone else. That they are the ones that hold absolute truth. The Christians, the Jews, the same way, the Taoists, they all make a claim of absolute, objective morality. And so that can't be true, but that's how society sees that. Let's all just get along together. Because you can't push in on my truth and I won't push in on your truth. But there is a moral law. And we'll go through, as we go through, we'll see that there is a moral law. But since we're still in philosophical presuppositions, and we're still looking at things from a philosophical standpoint, we can set the moral law up in the same type of argument that we have with our other arguments that we've presented so far. And we can say, every law has a lawgiver. I know these seem very simplistic, and they are, but when you start digging into them to prove them, they get rather deep at times. But every law has a lawgiver. The second premise is there is a moral law, and we'll look at that. And then since those two are true, therefore there is a moral lawgiver. There's some superior being, authoritative being, that gives this moral law. And so we'll start with the first one. Every law has a lawgiver. That's pretty intuitive. That's not anything, earth-shaking. Every law that we have in society came from a lawgiver. A city council passes a city ordinance or a city law. And so those people, they are lawgivers in that sense. Our state representatives and state congressmen pass laws, and so they are lawgivers in that sense. U.S. government's the same way. And so there are laws, and every law that we can think of has a particular lawgiver, and it's been that way throughout all of history. And so there's not much opposition there. We can say, yes, that's true. Every law has a lawgiver. And so we move to the second one, and this where it gets a lot more interesting. And this is where we run up against the relativists that say there is no absolute moral law. It's all relative. It's all what you want it to be. And it does have, like I said, this position does have a lot of opposition. But I want to go back to this question and this idea about how do governments govern if there's not a moral law, if there's not an absolute concrete moral law. You see, without an agreeable or without a concrete moral law, there's no way to distinguish between good and evil. With no moral law, the concepts of good and evil are just opinions. What's good and what is evil is just your opinion against my opinion. Good is whatever I say that it is. It's right for me, should be right for you. Society can't exist that way, though. Society has to agree on some basic type of morality, some basic type of moral law. Even the relativists in the world that claim there is no absolute moral truth don't live by what they say. One way to tell that is let a thief get robbed. They're the first ones to call the police, and they scream the loudest. So they expect a moral law to apply for them, but they don't want to equate that or give that to other people. Norm Geisler has a good summary of that. He says, the moral law is not always the standard by which we treat others, but is nearly always the standard by which we expect others to treat us. And that's so very true. You know, that's the golden rule, and that's the catch to the golden rule, right? We want everyone to treat us the way we want to be treated, but we don't often do it in reverse. Human rights are not grounded in opinion. There's universal human rights. And a lot of these people that argue for these universal human rights are Darwinist and materialist, and they don't have anything to stand on. Organizations like Amnesty International or the International Justice Mission, organizations like that, have to be grounded in some common, recognized, higher authority. Whether they recognize it or not, or whether they realize it or not. Those organizations are grounded in an absolute truth and not a relative truth. This is closely related to the argument from evil. The atheists claim that God can exist because there's evil in the world. And if God is good, then why does He allow evil to occur? And this is, one of the big arguments that the atheists put up. But evil in the world doesn't disprove that God exists. Evil in the world proves that there is good in the world. You can't know what good is without having evil. And so man knows what is good and evil. And because that he knows that is because there's a moral law that's written on his consciousness. He instinctively knows what's good and evil. And remember that an atom is neither good nor evil. So our concepts of good and evil are another intangible aspect. If there's no moral law and no absolute standard for moral behavior, then there's no difference in Hitler and Mother Teresa. How do you distinguish between those two if there's no ultimate moral law? I take the side that Hitler was great. You take the side that Mother Teresa was evil. And who's to decide that argument if there's no absolute moral law that everyone agrees upon. It's only the moral law that's seated in the consciousness and that's written on the human heart that we're able to even make the distinction between the two of those. It's only because there is a moral law that things repulse us. Things jerk our heart out, things that bring tears to our eyes, is only because we have written on our hearts good and evil. For a number of reasons, the Darwinists and evolutionists have very little to say about the moral law. They can't explain where it comes from because, like we've said, it's like self-consciousness. It's not made up of atoms. And if you don't have atoms, you can't have molecules. And if you can't have molecules, you can't have cells. And if you can't have cells, you can't have evolution. In other words, the moral law didn't come to you from the goo via the zoo. It's a brute fact that resides deep in the recesses of your heart. It is a created reality. The moral law is a created reality that resides within us. Once again, Anthony O'Hare says, "It is our perception of good and evil, of just and unjust, which distinguishes us from the animals." The Darwinists live and die by their presuppositions. Consider this. There's no moral obligations pending upon the animal kingdom. Your dog or your cat, your livestock, your horse, none of those things have a moral law that's bearing upon them. They're not obligated to a moral law of any kind. The lion kills the zebra and eats it, but he doesn't murder the zebra. You know, oftentimes the male dog will breed his sister or his mother, but he doesn't commit incest. Hammerhead sharks breed extremely violent. They're very violent in their breeding. But the male shark doesn't rape the female. There's nothing morally wrong with these behaviors because there's no moral obligation pending upon these animals. These are things in the animal world that just are. They are brute facts. But those things are not just things that just are within human society. Those things enrage us. They are outrageous to us. They are egregious violations of moral obligations. And why? Because God didn't create Himself. And it follows from that, God didn't create Himself, that He doesn't create moral values either. Because He is moral. He is just. And He didn't create Himself. It's a brute fact. It's a standing. It's just how it is. God is absolutely just, and we are absolutely just. Since the Darwinists believe that survival of the fittest is a natural outworking of evolution, then there's no moral law that says that the Holocaust was wrong. There's nothing to offend us about the Holocaust. They're just natural outworkings of evolution. Hitler was exercising his survival of the fittest. There was nothing evil there. It's no different than the lion killing the zebra or the dog breeding his sister. It just is if there's no moral law. The Russian philosopher Fyodor Dostoevsky said this: "If God didn't exist, everything would be permitted." You see, for Hitler, God didn't exist. That's why he wasn't appalled by that. He wasn't offended by that. He had, in Paul's language, suppressed the truth so deeply that he didn't feel the moral obligation toward his fellow man. And since he felt no moral obligation, he felt there was no moral law pending upon him. It was just his opinion. And the strongest survives and the weakest perishes. Even the hardcore German atheist Friedrich Nietzsche wrote, "Morality has truth only if God is true, and it stands or falls with faith in God." We could reword that and we could say, morality has truth only if we don't suppress the truth about God. Because the truth is there. Paul says we either suppress it or we don't. So we said that every law has a lawgiver. And we've said that there is a moral law. And we agree with that. And so the conclusion stands, therefore there is a moral lawgiver. There's a lot of deep information here that you can think about, consider, and ponder. The moral law is a direct relation to our self-consciousness, which is part of our unique design that was given us by the Creator. And so if we look at what we're doing, we've said that our original statement is that God exists and Christianity is true. And we've been providing evidence toward this one opening statement in our court case, you might say. And we've looked at the Kalam cosmological argument. We looked at the teleological argument. We looked at the argument from consciousness and self-consciousness, or how our mind works. And then from that we said that the moral argument, we said that this moral law resides within the deep recesses of our self-consciousness. And it is something that we do not share with the rest of creation. And so there's something else that we can say about God and about the attributes of God based upon this argument that we've had. And we've been calling this our Christian worldview portrait. And so we'll, just by refresher, we'll look, and we said from the cosmological argument, we said there exists an uncaused personal creator of the universe, who in relation to the universe is beginningless, changeless, immaterial, timeless, spaceless, and enormously powerful. From the teleological argument, we were able to add the design, unity, order, and complexity of creation itself implies the creator of the universe is a highly intelligent designer who purposefully designed and brought the universe into existence. And then from the argument from consciousness, we said that human beings that God freely chose to create consist of two substances, one material, one immaterial, one body being uniquely human, one spirit being similar in substance to God, who is spirit. And then we can say further, the purposeful spiritual creator and designer of the universe, God, is a moral and just being who imparted moral values into the spiritual consciousness of human beings whom He created, with the expectation that they embrace and fulfill His moral law. And so that's what we've been able to get out of that. But that always brings a question, and the question is naturally why? Why was the universe so finely tuned for life to thrive and to come about, to do so well? Why were human beings universally endowed with such capabilities that we have? Why was the universe made with all its fine tuning that we see to help life exist? How come human beings were given a self-consciousness that is above all the animals? Why were they given that? And now why do they have a moral law that's written upon their heart? We ask why. And maybe the answer to the question why is this. If the creator of the universe is infinitely moral and infinitely just, then wouldn't we expect the personal, intelligent, purposeful, intentional designer and giver of the moral law to want to communicate with the creatures He had so created? Why did He go through all of this if He would want to just be silent for us to not have any communication with Him. We have all these capacities. We have a soul. We are embodied souls, unlike any of the other animals. What is that for? Our soul is not just for us to sit and talk among each other. It has a purpose. The purposeful Creator. He had purpose. He had intentionality. There's a plan behind all of this. We're not just random beings. These attributes that we have all have a purpose, especially those that attend to the soul. And the question is, why would He give us all those if He didn't somehow want to communicate with us? There's an interesting thing. There's an ancient people group that claims that very thing. They claim that God communicated with them, that He did want to communicate with them, and He did communicate with them. And He said that He did create the universe, and that He did make all of mankind, and He did impart this moral law into human beings. He also said that He loved human beings, and that He loved His creation, and He cared for them, and He didn't want them to be hopeless. Those are the things that this ancient people group have said. They've written about. And one of those things that this ancient people group has said is that Yahweh would send a Redeemer who would propitiate the sins of all of those people who would believe. It turns out that there's strong evidence from history that such a man lived. That there was such a man that lived in the first century. A man who claimed to be the Son of God. A man who claimed to come to cleanse the world of sin. To redeem mankind. And it's the history of this man that we're going to spend the next 5 or 6 weeks on. We're going to look at from a historical viewpoint of the resurrection of Jesus. And so at this point I want to take just a quick break from the lesson, because I want to say that we're fixing to really change gears. We've been in a philosophical mode all through these arguments where we've drawn on philosophy, we've used some science along the way, and we've drawn from science to be able to make these arguments. And remember, we're crafting these arguments for the Michaels of the world who don't believe in the Bible. As Trevor said this morning, how do we reach those people that don't believe in the Bible? And thank you for the plug this morning. I appreciate that. So we're making a transition here. We're going from this philosophical approach to these things to a historical approach. And it's a significant change. And so for the resurrection, Michael, who still doesn't believe the Bible is the Word of God, we're going to talk to him from common ground again. And we're going to talk to him, approach him from history. We're going to take a purely historical approach to the resurrection. And so what that means is we're going to pull our Bibles out. But for now, our Bibles are a collection of historical documents. And that's how they'll be presented. So we know they're inspired. We know the Holy Spirit inspired the apostles and the authors that wrote all of Scripture. But Michael still doesn't believe in that. And so at the very minimum, these are a compilation of historical documents that have been all put in one binding together. These are ancient historical documents. They're history. If you find a letter that great-granddad wrote home to great-grandma from World War I, that's a historical document. That's what these are at the very least. They're historical documents, and that's the common ground that we begin to speak with Michael about. So we'll go through Scripture, we'll read out of the Bible, we'll look at all of them, but for this time being, we're not going to look at them as being inspired, we're going to look at them as historical documents. This is a hard thing to get your mind around. This was very, very difficult for me. The first time I did this years ago, it was a very hard concept, and there was some points in some of the reading that I became quite frightened. And, came to the realization that, I'm in seminary, they're not going to leave me hanging, so it'll eventually work out. But anyway, it was a different way of coming about it and looking at it. But when you go through all of it and you get to the end, then you can go, wow. Wow, this is a historical proof now, and I didn't rely upon inspiration to get there. And so then after that, we'll lead on. Like I said, we're eventually going to end up with the inspiration of Scripture, but that is where we are. And so I'm hoping that everyone is ready to dive into the historical argument for the resurrection of Jesus. I'm going to begin a little bit. We've got about 10 minutes. So that's the handout that I handed out this morning. At one point I had written a series of 5 blogs about the resurrection, and they tie into what we're going to talk about here pretty well. So beginning next week, I'll give you one of those blogs every week. It's about 3 pages long is all. Real easy to read, and I'll give you one of those along, and we'll look at that. That'll kind of help you. It's written in a different kind of language, so in a different way, so it'll help go with what we're talking about in this class. But we'll go ahead and move forward. Anybody have any questions? Any concerns? Any thoughts? Everybody know where we're going? We're all going to heaven, right? All right, so we'll go ahead and begin. So what I've done, there's been a lot written about the resurrection, and here again you can go about it from different angles, but I've been really moved by one particular New Testament scholar named Michael Licona. He teaches New Testament at the University of Houston, and really good his approach. He wrote his PhD thesis on the resurrection. He was a student of Gary Habermas. If anyone knows Gary Habermas, is probably the leading scholar of the resurrection, and Licona is one of his students. So what Licona did was he took a lot of Gary Habermas's research and material, and then he built his own defense for the resurrection based off of Gary Habermas's material. And so it's really good. And I'm going to skip through. This is a summary we just did. And there we were. We said there was, all right. So, like I said, we'll begin to look at from a historical standpoint, and what we're going to do first is we have a roadmap. We'll get to it in just a minute, but just a sketch of what we're going to do is we're going to look at all the sources that mention Jesus and the resurrection. We're going to go through those. We're going to evaluate those. So like I said, this is a historical method. This is a method that historians use if they want to investigate something. They're going to write a book about, let's say, Custer. Then they go out and get all the information they can get on Custer, and then they start reading through it, and then they qualify it. Is this a good piece of information or not? And they'll rank it and qualify it. They'll set the stuff that's not helpful to one side. The good stuff they'll set over here. Then they'll begin to pare down and begin to write about those good sources. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to go through all the sources that name, that's not entirely true. We're going to go through some significant sources that name Jesus. We're going to list all the sources that name Jesus. But we're going to go through and screen all these different sources. And then after that, we're going to look at what's called the minimal bedrock facts. And these are facts that even the atheists agree to. They're just general facts about the resurrection. And so based upon those general facts, then we're going to build a model so that we can compare different theories together. And then once we get our model built, then we're going to look at 3 different resurrection theories, and then we're going to compare that to the Christian resurrection narrative. And then we'll rank all of it like you would a model. We're completely looking at this as historians. We're not Bible scholars. We're not, not inspired documents. This is just a historian looking at historical documents. We'll see how all this ranking comes out, and then we'll make some distinctions from there. So you have the first third of this outline. You'll get the next third next week and on till we get through. I think I've got 120 pages of text here to go through, so this is going to take us, like I say, several weeks to go through, but I think it's a great exercise to go through. We've got about 5 minutes, so I hate to get started any further along than that. Anyone have any questions or any thoughts? Everybody bring their Bibles next week, and like I say, we'll start reading through some scriptures and some things like that. So we have more sources than you might think we have that mention Jesus, and we'll be looking through the through the 4th century. So the first 300 years, basically 350 years, what was written about Jesus. And what we'll be looking for is sources that give us an independent testimony. So that's an important phrase to remember, and we'll talk about it again next week. For something to be an independent testimony, it can't be just relaying a story that they heard from somebody else. You know, it has to be, it can't be a story of a story of a story of a story. And so we weed through a lot of these sources. You can find stuff that was written in the 5th and 6th century that say, you know, this ancient writer said that Jesus was crucified and was buried, and on the 3rd day they went looking for him, they couldn't find him. Well, that person that wrote that in the 4th or 5th century, he wasn't an eyewitness, and he didn't know the eyewitnesses. So it's a second-hand, third-hand, fourth-hand fact, and so that makes the use of that as a historical document, it's not quite so good. So when we do that, we start narrowing down the list of what we have, sources that we can use for the historical investigation of the resurrection. But it's really going to be good.
What good is an atheist or a believer that writes a check? Is that a historical argument? That writes a check and then puts a date on it, June 11th, 2023.
Right.
Since when?
Since when what?
Since June 2023 years since what happened?
I don't guess so.
Isn't everyone proclaiming that they believe
That's right.
that Jesus was here when they write a check and put a date on it?
No.
They don't look at
No, they don't. No, they're acquiescing to Western culture. The Jews don't believe it. The Jews don't go by it. They have to write it, but they don't believe it. But they have to acquiesce to Western culture, because you can't go to the bank and write it's June 23rd, 5,873, which is something like that. What the Jews, the year is, I don't know what it is. Anybody know what the Jewish year is right now? 6,000? Whatever it is, 6,000 and something, I don't know. They believe that that's the true year, that Christ hadn't come, and so the year is still 5,387 or whatever. They don't believe that it's 2023, but they acquiesce because they can't function in society by writing a check that's got an unknown year on it. So there's a lot of that goes on. Hardcore atheists live by a lot of Christian precepts for 2 reasons. Number one is they can't make their own worldview work without stealing from Christianity to make it work. It's the same thing with the absolute moral law. They can't make their morality system work. It's like the guy, the thief that goes out and steals, but he doesn't want anybody stealing from him. So he's taking a Christian worldview that they should treat me, nice. They shouldn't steal from me. They should have a moral law to not steal from me. So he's hijacking Christian thoughts to make his worldview work. And that's one way that you know that a worldview is wrong, is because they hijack Christian thought to make their worldview work. That's one reason.
On that subject, there's probably a bank in Brooklyn where there are more Jews than there are in Israel. That's different.
That's possible. Yeah, that's very possible. But that's the second reason, though. They have to, the whole world now is speaking English. Why? You think they like English? No. But they learn it because they acquiesce to English, because that's the business language. That's the way things work. And so there's all kinds of things that people do. There's things that we do that we have to do that we're opposed to. I don't like paying taxes.
The months of the year, like you were talking about the date, the year date, the months are all named after Greek gods.
That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah. Janus for January, and yeah, on and on and on. All the months are after Greek gods as well.
Well, let me ask a simpler question. How do you think that guy got those curls on each side of his face?
You did this?
Yeah, I think he played with it. That's the look I'm going for, by the way.
Some people like you, Steve, need an education.
I'm fixing to get this cut off. I can't keep my hands off of it. It's
Actually, not all Jewish men do that. Only the really Orthodox
That's right.
Jewish
Yeah.
men do that. And living in a Jewish community in New York City, that's the first time I had ever seen men with the curls down the side.
Yeah.
But there were many of them. My neighbors had numbers tattooed on their arms. The world was different, and I was just a country Texas girl, and I talked to everybody. A lot of them did not know their neighbors on the landing where they were until I got there. But
You helped him out with that?
if you have a little redheaded baby, and redheads to Jewish people, it was a wonderful thing. And they actually began speaking with each other
Be wonderful, man.
because
Yeah.
I was there, but they didn't. It was not the characteristic or the manner of them.
Yeah.
They were so afraid.
Yeah.
They didn't even speak to their neighbors.
Yeah. Wow.
I bought a book and it